Hello, I'm here today hosting Afterwards with Matt Richtel, and congratulations on your new and very powerful book, A Deadly Wandering. I think it's a story about a crash, and yet so much more. You know, it's a story, as you write about tragedy and redemption, and I'd say it's you could call it the canary in the coal mine case of how we're living with our technology, both in destructive and constructive ways. So I think we have a lot to talk about, and I wanted to welcome you.
Where was that when I needed an elevator pitch? That was great.
Well, I wanted to welcome you and also start off by asking, you know, the word deadly is in the title. So how deadly, what is the scope, before we go into the story, how deadly is this trend? And what are we talking about historically, especially vis-a-vis drunk driving, which everyone's heard about?
Yeah. First of all, I like your canary in the coal mine reference, and the reason I like it relative to the question you just asked is the canary is that if you are texting while you're driving, it will kill you. But it's really indicative of a lot of other things when it comes to distraction, sitting at the dinner table, you know, being counterproductive at work. So that's kind of the extreme example. But how deadly, specifically to your question? Drunk driving, I think now is about 10,000 a year in the US. It's the biggest number that we can measure of the 30 to 40,000 deaths we have a year. It's come down sharply. The likes of Candace Lightner and MAD and Strong Laws have brought it down sharply. What about texting and driving? The real answer is we don't know yet. We have some very decent estimates about the amount of crashes and the amount of deaths caused by phone use by drivers. And just let me pause and say now this has been like a 8-minute sentence and say, shall I tell you why it's complicated?
Yes.
So the estimates, like from the National Safety Council, would put at about, if memory serves, about 1.5 million of 5.6 million crashes in the U.S. owing to phone use. But those are estimates. And the reason we don't know is because it's very hard to track for police agencies. It's hard to get the information. People lie. And we just started trying to collect the data. So the estimates are based largely on how much we know people are using phones and how many crashes there are. Just to give one example of how we know that the official numbers are so far off, there's a number from about 2011, which is the latest data we have, of deaths owing to phone use. And Tennessee remarks 93 cases, and the state of New York remarks 1. Just simply impossible. We're not tracking it accurately. So the short answer is we don't know. The long answer is all the science and everything we see on the roadways say it's a big and growing problem.
Well, tell me a little bit about the story, because we are dealing with a very, very important problem. You know, it does seem to be on the rise, even if we're not quite sure of the scope of the problem. Tell me about the story, the accident, briefly, because it's a very gripping model or example of what could happen to all of us.
Yeah. When I thought about writing about all the science, I'm sure we'll talk about it at some point, I thought, you know, what interests me when I read anything is story. It's character, it's narrative, it's emotion, it's conflict. And I could not have invented and could not have imagined the story that I discovered in reporting this out. It starts with a young man, 19 years old, September 22, 2006, and he's driving to work at 6:30 in the morning. It happens to be the last day of summer, but already there's freezing rain and it is dark, and he is going 55 miles an hour, which is the speed limit, but he's swerving periodically across the yellow divider. And this is noticed by the guy driving behind him, who happens to be a farrier, a horseshoe maker, who's got 2 tons of horseshoes and horseshoe making equipment, a missile at highway speeds. And the last time Reggie Shaw, the young man who I mentioned earlier, swerves across the yellow divider, he clips a Saturn. carrying, again, can't make this stuff up, 2 not only fine family men, but no kidding, rocket scientists, the real thing, building boosters for the next space shuttle. He clips them, they spin across the road, they are hit by the Farrier broadside, and the 2 men in the Saturn are killed instantly.
Mm-hmm. It's quite a tragedy.
Quite a tragedy.
But of course, as we're talking about, it's an example of so much more. So let's get into, what this represents. For instance, one of the most amazing reasons, and I think it might have been why you came to write this book. You can tell us about that. But one of the most amazing issues related to this is, why do people do this? We can talk about, do they know the risk? In 2006, there were arguments to and from.
Yeah.
But I guess we can assume now that many people have an inkling of the dangers. So let's start to talk about a little bit about why we do such a self-destructive thing as
texting, right. So just to square the circle, in case it's not explicit, Reggie was texting. He denied it. He stops down the road 100 yards unscathed. He says he hydroplaned. There's a fierce law enforcement hunt, essentially, a Sherlock Holmes-like meets the digital age experience, and they discover, after 18 years of looking, that he has texted 11 times in the minutes and seconds around the crash, maybe at the crash. You have this first ever criminal trial, this historic precedent. But you ask the question, well, just to finally, he's texting something innocuous, like good morning, to a young woman he's barely even dating. He's just getting to know. What would compel a young man who is a decidedly good person, although as you read in the book, he's got a little bit of a checkered past when it comes to telling the truth. So he's got some issues, but he's a decidedly good guy, kind of the all-American guy. What would compel someone who knows the difference from right and wrong to look down in his lap? This turns out to be a long scientific journey, and so let me try to break it down into pieces. Maybe the best way to start, Maggie, is to give you an image of us going back, let's say 1,000,000 years or 100,000 years. Picture a caveman or cavewoman, and that person is tending to a fire, and he or she gets a tap on the shoulder. I would just ask you, what do you think, were it you, would you be able to avoid turning around? If someone tapped on your shoulder and you were tending a fire and didn't know who it was, do you think you could ignore the tap?
No, not at all.
Obviously, I mean, leading question, I'm sorry, Your Honor, of course you couldn't. You don't know if it's threat, you don't know if it's opportunity, is it food, is it someone with a spear? That's the first image I would put in people's minds, and I'm going to get into the neuroscience of this in a minute. But essentially, when you're driving in the car and the phone rings, the first thing to think about is that is a proverbial tap on the shoulder, Maggie, and it is from anyone, anywhere in the world, and you've got no idea, is that opportunity, is that threat, is that my boss, is that my spouse, is that my potential mate? It's unknown, and so this technology has given us kind of like a warp speed version of the tap on the shoulder. Now, maybe I should pause here and talk, before I go to the next kind of level of the lure, about the neuroscience of that moment. Is that
Yes, tell us a little bit about the limits to our attention, which have been, well studied for, more than a century. We're a very limited animal when it comes to our attentional capabilities, right?
Yeah, exactly. So what's happening in that moment, and it'll kind of go indirectly to answering that question of limits, is let's go back to the cave person. The cave person tending to the fire is using this part of the head, the prefrontal cortex. They call it executive control. It's the thing that makes us most human. It's the thing responsible for art, architecture, civilization. But when this tap comes, or the roar of a lion, it sends a signal up from here, the reptile parts of the brain, much more primitive survival mechanisms. And let's say in the case of the lion, it says,